Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise to get you truly well-informed on the issues that matter most. Today, we're diving into a topic that, well, it gets right to the heart of justice and equity in America. And I want to start with a statistic that I think truly captures a kind of generational shift. For Black men born back in 1981, 1 in 3 were likely to experience imprisonment in their lifetime. 1 in 3. Now, fast forward just 2 decades, right? For those born in 2001, that number shifts to 1 in 5. Now, on the surface, that looks like a significant drop, doesn't it? Maybe a sign of progress. But what does that shift truly signify? What new dynamics are maybe at play here? And what do these evolving numbers reveal about the ongoing pursuit of justice in America today?
It's a really critical question and a complex one. It demands a closer look, I think, beyond just those raw numbers. Because, while a decline from 1 in 3 to 1 in 5 might indicate some positive movement, the enduring reality is still deeply troubling. That 1 in 5 for Black men born in 2001, it remains disproportionately high compared to other demographics, way high. It immediately signals that racial disparities aren't just, historical relics. They're persistent, they're evolving realities that continue to profoundly shape lives and communities right now, even if the nature of the disparity is changing.
That's a powerful way to frame it. And that's exactly what this deep dive is all about today. We want to unpack this complex and frankly deeply persistent issue of racial disparities throughout the U.S. criminal justice system. We're going to look at everything from youth involvement, those earliest points of contact with law enforcement, all the way through federal sentencing guidelines, and then into the challenges of reentry and community supervision. This isn't just about understanding crime stats or, policy minutia. It's really about discerning the deep-seated structures that shape individual lives and entire communities across the country.
Right. And to give you the most comprehensive picture possible, we've pulled together a truly robust stack of sources for this. Our material draws from really in-depth reports by leading advocacy and research groups like the Sentencing Project and the NAACP, the big names. We've also incorporated rigorous academic studies, some groundbreaking work from Harvard, findings published in Humanities and Social Sciences Communications, and further informing our discussion are cutting-edge insights from the Pew Charitable Trusts, and even specific policy proposals coming out of the Justice Department itself. Each of these offers a unique and, I think, crucial lens on this critical, multifaceted topic. It helps us understand not just what's happening, but, why it's happening and what can actually be done about it.
Okay, so our mission today is pretty clear. Cut through all this information, synthesize it, and give you a clear, in-depth understanding. We want to cover the facts, the underlying causes, and the ongoing efforts being made to address these disparities. Think of this as your essential shortcut to being truly well-informed on this profoundly impactful issue, equipping you with the knowledge to grasp its nuances. Now, let's start unpacking this. Okay, let's start with the big picture then, putting mass incarceration into context, both globally and historically. Despite seeing 2 decades of declining crime rates across the nation, the United States still incarcerates a historically and comparatively enormous segment of its population. The scale of this is frankly astounding. Consider this. The U.S. is home to nearly 25% of the world's entire prison population, while we only make up about 5% of the global population. Just let that sink in for a moment. The sheer disproportion.
It really highlights a profound anomaly, doesn't it? And how the U.S. approaches justice and, social control compared to other nations. The incarceration rate today is a staggering 3 times higher than it was back in 1980. And this elevated rate persists even with crime rates hovering near decades-low levels. That's the paradox. The growth has been monumental. From 1980 to 2015, the number of incarcerated people surged from roughly 500,000 to an astonishing 2.2 million. This wasn't some gradual organic shift, It was a massive, concentrated societal transformation, driven by very specific policy choices over a relatively short period.
And the international comparisons really just hammer this home, this unique American approach. If you look at people in the U.S., they are more than 10 times as likely to be in prison or jail as folks living in countries like Denmark or Sweden or the Netherlands. We're even 4 times as likely as residents of the United Kingdom to be behind bars. These stark differences, they really compel us to ask, what fundamental assumptions, what objectives underpin our system that lead to such a wildly divergent path compared to other developed nations? And what are the societal costs of this approach?
That really raises the key question, doesn't it? Why does the U.S. rely so heavily on incarceration? to manage societal challenges that many other developed nations address through different means, often with lower recidivism, better social outcomes. It points to deeply embedded structural differences in our legal framework, our social safety nets, maybe even cultural attitudes towards punishment versus rehabilitation. It's not just about crime rates. It's about the very philosophy of justice itself.
Right. So, moving beyond the sheer scale, let's zoom in on the specific disparities in adult incarceration that continue to, well, plague the system. While African Americans and Hispanics together make up about 32% of the U.S. general population, they constitute a staggering 56% of the U.S. incarcerated population. 56%. And breaking that down further, African Americans specifically are incarcerated at more than 5 times the rate of white individuals. These numbers don't just speak volumes, they scream systemic inequities.
They absolutely do. This isn't just a minor imbalance, right? It's a profound overrepresentation. It strongly indicates that systemic factors, not just individual level ones, are at play here. And a key insight is how this pattern of disparity isn't confined to one group. It permeates across various groups. For instance, the imprisonment rate for African American women is twice that of white women. This demonstrates that these patterns of inequity are pervasive. They affect different groups within the population, often compounding existing disadvantages.
That's a crucial point, and one that's often overlooked, I think, the gendered impact within these racial disparities. And circling back to our opening statistic, that generational shift we mentioned, the 1 in 5 figure. 1 in 5 Black men born in 2001 is likely to experience imprisonment in their lifetime. Now, while that does represent an improvement from the 1 in 3 for those born in 1981, it's still troublingly high. It underscores that the fight for equitable justice is, well, far from over. And get this, for Black men born in the late 1970s who didn't even complete high school, the odds of imprisonment for at least a year by their 30s, it shot up to over 60%. These aren't just abstract statistics. For so many people, they are literal life trajectories predetermined by race, class, and opportunity.
That's exactly right. And the reach of these disparities, it extends far beyond just prison walls. Even lower-level forms of engagement with the police and judicial system, things like arrests, community supervision like probation and parole, these disproportionately affect racial and ethnic minority groups. For example, nearly half, 48.9% of Black men are arrested by age 23. Compare that to 37.9% of white men. This clearly illustrates that the disproportionate contact with the criminal legal system begins early. It's a much broader phenomenon than just the official incarceration rates suggest, shaping lives long before any potential prison sentence.
And here's where it gets particularly disheartening. Youth incarceration.
Yeah.
Despite a significant 46% fall in juvenile placements across the country over the last decade, which sounds good, Black-white racial disparities in youth incarceration actually grew by more than 10% in 23 states during that same period. As of 2023, Black youth are now at an all-time high of 5.6 times as likely to be placed in juvenile facilities as their white peers.
Right.
An all-time high disparity, even as overall placements are down. It really suggests that while fewer young people are being incarcerated overall, the system is becoming more racially skewed in many places. That's concerning.
Yeah, what really stands out there is that even with overall reductions in juvenile detention, the gap is widening in many places. That's a critical insight. It means that maybe existing reforms or shifts in practice aren't always reaching those who are most disproportionately affected. Or perhaps the criteria for who gets caught in the net is somehow becoming more biased. And we see significant state-level variations too, which really underscores the impact of local decisions, local policies. Illinois and New York, for example, saw their racial disparity at least double. That indicates specific policy or enforcement choices that made the problem worse. But then, in contrast, you have Maine, Utah, and Rhode Island. They managed to decrease theirs by at least half. That shows positive change is possible with targeted efforts. Even in a state like Alabama, where the Black population is relatively smaller, Black youth are still 3.4 times as likely to be held.
And it's really important to emphasize this isn't just limited to Black youth, right? This crisis. Tribal youth are almost 4 times as likely to be incarcerated than their white peers, and Latino youth also face alarmingly high rates of confinement. It truly highlights a systemic issue for youth of color broadly, points to structural failures affecting multiple minority groups.
Indeed. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals how this disproportionality just accumulates. At every single step of the juvenile justice system, African American children, okay, they represent 14% of the overall youth population, but they make up 32% of those arrested, 42% of those detained, and a staggering 52% of those whose cases are judicially waived, meaning transferred to criminal court for adult prosecution. This isn't just a slight bias, it's a clear escalating pipeline of increasing overrepresentation. It pushes
Yeah.
minority youth further into the system at every single decision point.
Okay, let's talk about jails for a moment. Often seen as just temporary holding spaces, right? But the disparities here offer a crucial, kind of immediate snapshot of inequity in action. Black people are admitted to jail at more than 4 times the rate of white people. And once they're there, they stay an average of 12 days longer. And this isn't just an isolated finding from one report. It's a consistent pattern seen in studies across multiple counties, multiple jurisdictions.
And looking at the demographic nuances within that, we find that racial disparities in jail admissions and length of stay, they're largest among younger adults. That suggests a particularly intense impact on emerging generations. The length of stay gap is also notably greater among men and women. Even though it's important to note, Black women still face considerably higher admission rates than white or Hispanic women. This specificity kind of helps us understand where interventions might be most impactful and how these dynamics play out differently for various groups.
Now, here's a truly intriguing finding from some of the research we looked at. In jurisdictions where Black people make up smaller shares of the general population, they are actually more likely to be overrepresented in jail populations. That almost seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? You might expect the opposite.
It does seem counterintuitive, yeah. And this inverse correlation is a really critical insight. It might suggest that in areas with smaller Black populations, maybe the systems of policing and justice are less accustomed to, or perhaps less equipped to, address racial bias effectively. Or there could be a more pronounced othering effect, right? Where individuals from smaller minority groups are more easily singled out, maybe perceived as more of a threat, resulting in higher rates of contact and detention. If we connect this to the broader context, it implies a deeper structural issue rather than just, a reflection of community size or proportion. It highlights how bias can sometimes be amplified in less diverse settings.
And even a global event like the COVID-19 pandemic, which you might think would impact everyone somewhat equally, it actually revealed and even exacerbated these persistent disparities. The pandemic initially saw drops in jail populations. That was a national trend. But the decrease was actually greater for white people. Then, post-pandemic, as populations started to creep back up, the average number of Black individuals in jails rose by 8%, while white populations increased by less than 1%. It's a stark, sobering illustration of how existing inequities aren't just exposed, but can be significantly worsened by external crises. Okay, let's shift gears a bit now and look at some of the evolving factors that are reshaping these disparities, particularly the intertwining roles of class, education, and the long shadow of the war on drugs. So in the 21st century, the incarceration rate of Black Americans has actually fallen sharply, and our sources suggest this is very likely due to the de-escalation of the war on drugs. That in itself is a piece of genuinely hopeful news, I think, amidst a lot of these heavy statistics.
Yes, and while we should definitely acknowledge and celebrate that decline of Black incarceration, it's crucial to understand that it coincided with a significant and in many ways quite troubling trend, a rise in the imprisonment of white Americans with no college education. Between 1984 and 2019, the number of white Americans without a college degree sent to prison more than doubled. It climbed from about 60,000 to approximately 160,000. So as one disparity began to narrow, another one grew, revealing this complex shift in the dynamics of who is actually being incarcerated. And what's truly striking here, and I think offers a profound insight, is that this shift means educational inequality is now considered a greater factor than racial inequality in imprisonment rates for all major crimes. Now, this isn't to say race no longer matters. It absolutely does, as we've already laid out very clearly. But it highlights this compounding layer of disadvantage where educational attainment is now a significant predictor of involvement with the criminal justice system, and it intersects deeply with race. Exactly. And this trend in incarceration, it mirrors broader economic shifts across the country. That's where it gets particularly interesting and provides this powerful overarching insight. Research indicates that the economic prospects for Black Americans born into poverty have, in some measures, improved over recent decades, while tragically, those of white Americans born poor have, in many respects, actually worsened. Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton observe similar parallel patterns in life expectancy, rising for Black Americans, but actually falling for white Americans with no college education. They link this phenomenon directly to large-scale job loss among low-education workers, a devastating wave that first impacted Black Americans disproportionately back in the mid-20th century, and then tragically began to afflict low-education white Americans in the 21st century. It's a powerful illustration of how these deep economic and social dislocations manifest in highly visible, often tragic, health and justice outcomes for different demographic groups over time.
Wow. So, what does this all mean for the enduring legacy of the war on drugs? I mean, this infamous campaign, launched by President Nixon in 71, dramatically expanded by laws like the Anti-Drug Abuse Act in 86, the Sweeping Crime Bill in 94, it established much harsher drug sentences. And for decades, these laws disproportionately affected Black Americans, becoming really a cornerstone to the historical context of mass incarceration.
It absolutely is. And the historical impact was undeniably dramatic. I mean, just look at 1992. Black Americans with no college education were a staggering 14 times likelier to be sent to prison for drug offenses than their white counterparts in the exact same education group. 14 times. By 2019, however, that ratio fell dramatically to 1.5. Now, while that still represents a substantial and frankly unacceptable disparity, it marks a huge reduction, likely due to the de-escalation of the war on drugs and subsequent policy reforms. This monumental shift powerfully highlights the profound impact that targeted policy changes can actually have on reducing specific racial disparities within the system.
Right, but even with that de-escalation and those policy adjustments, it's crucial to recognize drug offenses still make up a meaningful portion of prison admissions, and they continue to account for significant racial and ethnic disparities. So while the problem is perhaps less extreme than it once was, it's certainly not a solved problem. Its shadow still looms large over our communities. Okay, let's move beyond these broad demographic and policy trends now and drill down into the specific touch points within the criminal justice system itself, starting with policing. And here's where it gets particularly insightful, I think, when we trace the historical roots of modern policing in the U.S. The origins of our modern-day police mentality, particularly in the South, can be traced directly back to the slave patrols created in the Carolinas in the early 1700s. Their explicit mission: establish a system of terror, pursue runaway slaves, control slave behavior with excessive force. These patrols were granted wide-ranging powers, like forcible entry into homes based on just mere suspicion. And they continued until the 13th Amendment finally abolished slavery.
Yet what's truly illuminating there is understanding how that foundational mentality, that focus on control, surveillance, and the use of force against a specific racialized population, how it seeped into the very DNA of policing in America. It wasn't originally conceived for universal public safety, right? But rather as a tool for enforcing a racial hierarchy and maintaining social order through subjugation. And these historical roots have, tragically, contributed to the ongoing issue of police brutality we still see today. Annually, somewhere between 900 and 1,100 people are shot and killed by police in the U.S. Now, while it's true that more white people are killed by police overall in raw numbers, Black people, who make up only about 13.4% of the population, account for 22% of fatal police shootings. Hispanic people are also disproportionately impacted. It indicates a clear and persistent racial disparity in the use of lethal force that continues right up to the present day.
And that disparity in how police force is applied, it extends directly to public perception, creating this significant and, well, troubling trust gap. There's a really clear divide. A striking 84% of Black adults say white people are treated better by police. Compare that to only 63% of white adults who agree with that statement. Similarly, 87% of Black adults believe the criminal justice system is inherently more unjust towards Black people, while only 61% of white adults agree. This persistent perception gap itself is a significant social problem. It reflects deeply divergent lived experiences and fundamentally erodes trust in institutions.
It truly does. And it raises this important question about the legitimacy of the system in the eyes of large portions of the population it's supposed to serve. A revealing study of juveniles found that Black teens were one-third more likely to report police contact by 8th grade. That's a striking 61% versus 41% for white teens. And this early contact, even if it doesn't result in an arrest, right, it's the single strongest predictor of later arrest. Youth who have police contact by 8th grade are almost 9 times more likely to be arrested by 10th grade. 9 times. This provides powerful support for what we might call a narrative of injustice, where initial police contact, rather than preventing problems, can paradoxically exacerbate them, especially in communities already experiencing deep-seated distrust and alienation from law enforcement.
And there's a demonstrable neighborhood effect at play here, too, which just compounds these issues. Police agencies often concentrate their enforcement efforts in neighborhoods known for higher crime rates, which, on the surface, seems logical. But this practice disproportionately increases the odds of police contact for juveniles in those areas, regardless of their individual offending behavior. It essentially creates this self-perpetuating cycle where communities under heavier surveillance are more likely to have their residents, particularly their youth, enter the criminal justice system, regardless of individual culpability sometimes.
Okay, let's transition now to the judicial processes, focusing specifically on sentencing and the discretion wielded by judges. A really pivotal moment in federal sentencing history was the Supreme Court's 2005 United States v. Booker ruling. That transformed federal sentencing guidelines from mandatory directives into just advisory recommendations. Now, the research on its actual impact on racial disparities is quite mixed. It makes it a complex area to interpret. Some studies suggest an increase in black-white disparities post-Booker, while others indicate no such increase, or maybe even a gradual decrease over time. So what you have here isn't a clear-cut outcome. It underscores the difficulty of isolating the effects of such a sweeping legal change.
It's certainly a complex legal landscape, but here's where it reveals a fundamental issue of transparency that really hinders effective analysis and reform. The federal judicial system isn't centralized, right? Individual sentences are shaped by these courtroom work groups within specific districts, yet public records from the U.S. Sentencing Commission, they don't attach judge names to individual sentences. This critical lack of specific data basically precludes a detailed, targeted analysis of individual judicial bias. There's this persistent call for the government to stop redacting judge identities, precisely to enable more accurate and accountable analysis. I mean, how can you effectively address bias if you can't even pinpoint where and by whom it's being exercised?
That's precisely the point. And it raises a profound question about accountability within the system, doesn't it? Without that granular data, it becomes incredibly difficult to identify, pinpoint, and effectively address individual judicial bias, even when the broader trends of disparity are undeniably clear. And those trends are quite stark, particularly at the state level. In 2016, a staggering 80% of state trial judges were white. That demographic reality contrasts sharply with the 30% of defendants of color they oversaw. And studies consistently show that judges are more likely to sentence people of color to prison or jail and impose longer sentences for similar crimes, even after meticulously accounting for crime severity and previous criminal history. This data strongly indicates that despite maybe good intentions, bias is still demonstrably present in judicial decision-making.
Okay, moving now into the realm of corrections. Let's briefly revisit that global context we established earlier. The U.S. continues to hold nearly 25% of the world's prison population, while only comprising about 5% of the global population. The system isn't just expansive, it's incredibly expensive. In 2012 alone, the U.S. spent nearly $81 billion on corrections. $81 billion. A figure made even more stark when you consider that spending on prisons and jails has increased at triple the rate of pre-K-12 public education spending over the past 30 years. It really highlights a fundamental societal choice about where our resources are going.
Yeah, and what's particularly revealing here is the presence of powerful financial incentives baked right into the system itself. Creates a significant point of contention for reformers. The number of people housed in private, for-profit prisons, for instance. It increased 5 times faster than the total prison population between 2000 and 2016. 5 times faster. To illustrate the scale, the 2 largest private corrections organizations generated a combined $3.5 billion in revenue in 2015 alone. This clear profit motive adds another complex and often ethically challenging layer to any discussion about reducing incarceration rates or achieving equitable justice, because there's a vested interest in maintaining, if not expanding, the current system.
And that profit motive, combined with the inherent biases we've been discussing, it can extend right through to parole and probation. Sources indicate that correctional officers, parole boards, probation and parole officers are often stricter, apply more scrutiny towards people of color. This inevitably leads to demonstrable disparities in things like prison discipline, solitary confinement placements, parole eligibility decisions, and findings of community supervision violations, even for minor technical stuff. It's this continuous, compounding cycle of disproportionate treatment that persists even after someone's been sentenced and is supposedly working towards rehabilitation or reintegration. Okay, beyond the immediate impact of incarceration itself, there are these profound, far-reaching societal ripples. They touch every aspect of life. Let's start with economic self-sufficiency. For formerly incarcerated individuals, particularly low-skilled Black men, incarceration significantly decreases the likelihood of even receiving job callbacks, and it severely depresses post-release employment opportunities overall. The sheer stigma of a criminal record, even if you didn't serve actual prison time, acts as this enormous barrier to opportunity, especially when you consider that over 90% of employers now conduct background checks.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, it creates this deeply entrenched, often intergenerational cycle of poverty and disadvantage that is just extremely difficult to break. Beyond just getting a job, incarceration also significantly depresses wages and wage growth over a person's lifetime. Even relatively short jail stints can have these long-term financial implications. You lose work experience, skills inevitably depreciate, and then there are the direct wage penalties associated with that persistent stigma. This isn't just a temporary setback for many people, it casts a lifelong economic shadow.
And these ripples extend directly into political engagement and trust, which are, cornerstones of a functioning democracy. Felony records can prohibit political participation in various ways. 48 states, for instance, prohibit those currently in prison from voting, and millions more are barred from exercising this fundamental right long after they have completed their sentences, sometimes for life. That's an enormous portion of the population that is effectively silenced, disenfranchised. It undermines the very principle of representative democracy.
Absolutely. This raises a really important question about the true integrity and inclusivity of our democratic processes. Mass incarceration, especially with its glaring racial disproportionality, predictably leads to heightened distrust in the law and legal institutions among African Americans who are disproportionately impacted. Furthermore, individuals who have incarcerated parents or partners are demonstrably less likely to vote. They're more likely to report feeling discriminated against, and they exhibit greater legal cynicism. It's this pervasive erosion of civic participation and trust that extends far beyond the individual directly impacted. It weakens the social fabric of entire communities.
Let's turn to health and well-being now, where the consequences are particularly stark, really disturbing. Incarceration is a profound and chronic stressor. We know this. It causes acute shocks to immune systems and contributes to long-term health dysfunction, even premature death. And the period immediately following release from prison or jail, it's particularly dangerous. It carries a staggering 13 times higher risk of death than for the general population, overwhelmingly due to drug overdose. That is a horrifying and sobering statistic. It highlights a severe public health crisis tied directly to the justice system.
It really does. But what's truly fascinating here and presents this sobering paradox is that while incarceration generally harms health, its negative health effects are uniquely absent and in some cases even reversed among Black men. It actually lowers their risk of mortality both during and somewhat counterintuitively after incarceration. This is a profound and deeply unsettling finding.
Wait, that's shocking. It's difficult to comprehend. Why would incarceration, which we know is a notoriously unhealthy environment, actually lead to a lower mortality risk specifically for Black men?
Well, researchers speculate, and this is speculation based on the data, that this paradox might be due to the increased protection from certain acute stressors that many Black men face in their communities outside of prison. Things like exposure to violence, lethal drug overdoses. Once they're within the controlled, albeit harsh prison environment, that exposure decreases. So for some Black men, the structured environment of prison, as restrictive and damaging as it is in many ways, may paradoxically offer a safer, more predictable, less immediately dangerous setting than what they might otherwise encounter on the outside. And this improved health outcome, the research suggests, also extends to chronic causes of death like cardiovascular disease and cancer, even in the years immediately following release. It's a stark, deeply troubling commentary on the extreme precarity and lack of safety many Black men face in their communities, to the point where incarceration itself offers this perverse form of health protection. This is a core insight, I think, into the desperation caused by systemic failure within broader society.
That's a profound, if incredibly dark, observation about the conditions many face. Wow. But the health impacts don't stop there, right? The concentration of incarceration in specific communities disproportionately shapes the risk of HIV among Black men and women living in those communities. One particularly impactful study found that after meticulously accounting for racial differences in incarceration rates, the HIV infection rate of Black women would have actually been lower than that of white women. This reveals how intimately connected criminal justice policies are to public health outcomes, especially for specific communities. It's not operating in a vacuum.
No, definitely not. And this extends into truly devastating generational health impacts. Children of recently incarcerated men suffer negative effects in utero. That's right, even before birth. Infants with an incarcerated father are an alarming 75% more likely to die within their first year, a risk tragically similar to that associated with maternal smoking during pregnancy. And beyond infancy, children with an incarcerated parent also experience significant negative impacts on their mental and behavioral well-being, their residential stability, and their long-term physical health. This truly illustrates the profound intergenerational cost of mass incarceration and racial disparity. It shows how its damage extends far, far into the future.
So, if these are the enduring realities and the far-reaching consequences, let's now try to unpack the why. What are the fundamental drivers of these persistent disparities? First, we have laws and policies that, even if not explicitly designed to be racist on their face, consistently have a disparate racial impact in practice. Lengthy sentences, life sentences, for instance, they are disproportionately levied on Black Americans and other people of color. More than two-thirds of people serving life sentences are people of color. And a staggering 55% of those serving life without parole are Black. These numbers are just alarming when you consider the overall demographics.
Yeah, and here's where it gets particularly unsettling, revealing this disturbing historical lineage. These extreme sentencing rates aren't just incidental. They're often exacerbated by things like habitual offender laws, three strikes policies, which, when you trace them back to their origins, actually date back to the eugenics movement. This historical connection provides a critical insight into the deeply problematic and often explicitly racist foundations of some of our most punitive contemporary laws. It suggests an enduring legacy that continues to impact who gets locked away for good based on flawed historical ideas.
And it's not just the explicitly harsh laws, is it? It's also these seemingly race-neutral enhancements that, in practice, have a profound and disproportionate effect. For instance, drug-free school zone laws. They mandate longer sentences for drug offenses committed near schools. These disproportionately affect urban residents and people of color simply due to the high population density in urban areas where schools are often closer to everything else, just a matter of geography. Similarly, gang affiliation enhancements disproportionately target Black and Latinx individuals. There's considerable evidence suggesting police and prosecutors are more likely to label them as gang members than their white counterparts. In California, for example, over 90% of people receiving gang enhancements in 2020 were Black or Latinx. The stated intentions of these laws might be presented as neutral, but their real-world impact clearly isn't.
Exactly. And this raises that important question about how we as a society truly assess the fairness and equity of our laws. Is it simply about the stated intent? Or, more critically, is it about the actual lived outcomes? The pervasive reliance on criminal histories in sentencing, bail decisions, diversion decisions that further exacerbates existing disparities. Because due to decades of disproportionate policing and prosecution, Black Americans are inherently more likely to have prior records. This creates this deeply entrenched, self-perpetuating cycle of disadvantage that makes it incredibly difficult to break free from the system once you're in it.
Okay, let's delve into racial bias in the discretionary decisions made by criminal legal professionals themselves, judges, prosecutors, police. While overt explicit prejudice has fortunately declined significantly over time, we know implicit racial bias is still pervasive. It's widespread among white Americans and importantly affects many people of color as well. It influences decisions and behaviors often unconsciously, even among those who genuinely disavow overt racism. It's that silent, subtle force that can still profoundly shape outcomes.
Right. And this implicit bias, it manifests in concrete and highly impactful ways throughout the entire system. Prosecutors, for instance, are demonstrably more likely to seek imprisonment and secure longer sentences for people of color. Federal prosecutors, they're twice as likely to charge African Americans with mandatory minimum offenses. Those offenses significantly limit judicial discretion and often lead to harsher sentences. They're also less likely to divert Black and Latinx individuals away from felony charges and more likely to oppose parole for Black individuals later on. And what's particularly telling here is the demographic reality of the profession itself. 95% of elected prosecutors in 2019 were white. That highlights a significant lack of diversity in a profession that wields immense power to shape individual lives and community destinies. It's a key insight into how institutional structures can perpetuate bias even without explicit individual intent.
And judges, as we touched on earlier, they're certainly not immune to these biases either. Largely white themselves, judges are consistently found to be more likely to sentence people of color to prison and impose longer sentences for similar crimes, even when accounting for relevant legal factors. And while judges might express a willingness to mitigate their own implicit biases, studies show they often express less inclination to actively address disparities caused by the actions of others like prosecutors or by laws that inherently have a disparate impact. It's kind of a systemic blind spot that hinders comprehensive reform.
It absolutely creates a critical barrier to change at a fundamental level. And similarly, beyond the courtroom, correctional officers, parole boards, probation, and parole officers, they also demonstrably exhibit bias. This leads to disparities in prison discipline, decisions about solitary confinement placements, critical parole release decisions. These decisions often rely heavily on subjective assessments of things like remorse and insight. criteria that are particularly prone to cultural bias and can disproportionately impact individuals from different backgrounds. It perpetuates unequal outcomes even within the supposedly rehabilitative phases of the system.
And what about the media's influence in shaping public perception, potentially reinforcing these biases? How does that play in?
Well, media representations can play a powerful role in what's known in behavioral science as respondent conditioning,
Yeah.
where repeated associations can lead the public to associate certain groups, often black individuals in this context, with fear or danger. For example, you might see similar civil disturbances labeled an unruly celebration when involving one group, but sensationalized as absolute chaos or a riot when involving another group, particularly if that group is predominantly black or brown. This kind of differential labeling conditions the public, often unconsciously, to associate particular groups with danger or criminality.
And why would news organizations do that? Is there an incentive?
Well, this raises an important question about reinforcement. News organizations can be inadvertently reinforced for using these kinds of narratives through increased viewership or online engagement. If describing certain groups with words associated with punishment, chaos, or danger brings more eyeballs, more clicks, that reinforcement can unintentionally perpetuate inaccurate or biased reporting. It's this cyclical process that highlights the systemic nature of how information dissemination itself can contribute to and reinforce racial bias within society. To put it simply, it's a bit like Pavlov's dogs. A consistent pairing of certain images or language with a racial group can eventually trigger an automatic, often negative response in the public.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the pervasive financial burdens and the chronic resource shortages that invariably disadvantage the poor within the criminal justice system. The system just disproportionately harms low-income individuals who we know are overwhelmingly people of color. Consider that Black Americans, for instance, earn about half as much and have only about 1/7 the net worth of white Americans on average. So for these communities, hurdles like affording cash bail, hiring an effective defense attorney, or accessing vital treatment or reentry services, they often become insurmountable obstacles.
Exactly. This creates a situation where poverty itself is, in effect, criminalized. Nearly 3/4 of individuals in jail today are unconvicted. They haven't been found guilty of a crime. They are often detained simply because they are unable to afford cash bail. Over 1/3 of jailed individuals earn less than $10,000 annually. That starkly illustrates the economic stratification within our jails. Furthermore, we know that pretrial detention significantly increases the likelihood of accepting unfavorable plea deals and ultimately receiving longer sentences, simply because people cannot afford to buy their freedom or effectively fight their case from outside of a cell.
And the problem is greatly compounded by just inadequate support services within the system itself. Many justice-involved individuals, for example, struggle with serious substance use disorders. It's a huge issue. Yet despite this clear need, only about 1/4 of those in prison with a diagnosed substance use disorder, or SUD, actually receives professional help for it while incarcerated. 1/4. Similarly, the cost of many diversion programs, which are designed to keep people out of prison and address root causes, often prohibitively expensive for the very people who need them most.
And adding another critical layer here, language barriers. These further disadvantage individuals with limited English proficiency, or LEP, people who struggle to effectively navigate this system in English. Underfunded translation services, a severe lack of staff training. It means that victims with LEP may not report crimes. Their cases take significantly longer to process. Accused individuals might be misled about their rights or end up staying in jail longer than necessary simply because they can't communicate effectively. It's an invisible but potent barrier that contributes significantly to systemic inequity. It ensures that those who can least afford it are further marginalized within an already complex system.
Okay, so given these profound challenges, what's actually being done? What are the potential solutions? Let's turn our attention now to the paths forward. The ongoing efforts and proposed solutions aimed at addressing these deep-seated disparities. One significant area of reform involves moderating extreme sentences. That seems like a logical place to start. Jurisdictions like California and Washington, D.C., for example, have bravely implemented second-look reforms. These provisions allow incarcerated individuals to petition for resentencing after serving a significant portion of their term, say 15 years, for crimes committed under age 25 in D.C. Although, as we've seen, progress in this area is definitely not without fierce pushback. We've seen vetoes, even congressional blocs attempting to stall or reverse these reforms.
That pushback is a really critical point. It underscores the ongoing struggle for reform, doesn't it? It highlights that even when legislative advances are made, there's this constant, often uphill battle to maintain and expand them against entrenched opposition. Another area of focus is reforming truth in sentencing laws. Some states, like Mississippi, have reformed these laws to reduce the proportion of a sentence that must be served before someone becomes eligible for parole, specifically lowering it from 85% down to 50% for certain violent crimes. That's a significant shift that can lead to earlier release and potential rehabilitation opportunities. But, it's also worth noting, unfortunately, we've seen other states move in the opposite direction recently, increasing mandatory minimums and reducing parole opportunities. So it's not a uniform trend.
And a really powerful kind of values-driven move has been the abolition of the death penalty in many places. 37 states in the U.S. have now either fully abolished the death penalty or haven't carried out an execution in over a decade. Washington State, for example, abolished capital punishment back in 2018, specifically citing compelling evidence of its pervasive racial bias. This is a clear instance where undeniable evidence of disparity has directly led to profound systemic change. It demonstrates what's possible when the facts are confronted head-on.
Precisely. That's a direct and unequivocal response to undeniable racial disparities in the application of the gravest penalty the state has. Beyond that, many jurisdictions are actively revising laws that, while maybe seeming neutral on their face, have clear disparate impacts in practice. A significant federal step was the First Step Act in 2018. That retroactively reduced the crack and powder cocaine sentencing disparity from that draconian 100.1 ratio down to 18.1. Still disparate, but a huge improvement. Building on this, the Department of Justice enacted a charging policy in 2022 to prospectively eliminate this disparity entirely for future cases. And states like California, Connecticut, and South Carolina have also taken crucial steps to equalize these penalties locally, which marks a major stride in addressing a historical injustice rooted in the war on drugs.
We're also seeing important changes to those seemingly race-neutral sentencing enhancements we talked about earlier, the ones that often ended up disproportionately punishing communities of color. Delaware, New Jersey, Indiana, and Utah, for example, have proactively scaled back those drug-free school zone enhancements. California modified its gang enhancement statutes, recognizing the bias there. And Virginia went so far as to discontinue law enforcement's use of controversial gang databases altogether. These are concrete examples of jurisdictions reevaluating and reforming laws that, while not explicitly racist in wording, had demonstrably racially disparate outcomes in practice.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating here, and represents a really proactive step towards preventing future inequities, is the introduction of racial impact statements. 9 states now, Iowa, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Oregon, Maine, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia, along with Washington, D.C., have implemented mechanisms for these statements. This allows lawmakers to evaluate the potential racial disparities of proposed legislation before it is adopted. It provides a crucial opportunity for foresight, for thinking ahead. Iowa's process, for instance, has already helped defeat several bills that would have significantly exacerbated existing disparities if they had passed. It's an essential, proactive measure aimed at identifying and mitigating bias right at the legislative drafting stage.
Okay, shifting to directly addressing bias within the system itself. Some prosecutorial reforms are truly groundbreaking, I think. San Francisco, for instance, initiated what they call race-obscured charging. This is a policy where prosecutors initially withhold race and other potentially biasing information during the early stages of charging decisions. The goal is simply to reduce implicit bias in who gets charged with what crime. California is now mandating this statewide by 2025, which is a really significant move. This is a direct, systematic attempt to combat implicit bias at a critical decision point.
It's a very promising and innovative strategy, really trying to interrupt those pathways of bias. Efforts are also being made to increase jury diversity and mitigate bias among jurors themselves. That's another critical piece. This includes initiatives to increase the diversity of jury pools. The Iowa Supreme Court, for example, mandated rigorous tests to ensure this. It also involves educating jurors on implicit bias. One U.S. District Court judge reportedly spent 25 minutes discussing implicit bias with potential jurors, showing videos, asking them to sign pledges to be aware of it. These are vital steps in trying to ensure fairer trials where outcomes are hopefully less influenced by unconscious prejudice.
We're also observing the development and implementation of more objective parole criteria, moving away from subjective feelings. States are moving towards evidence-based guidelines for parole evaluations, specifically designed to eliminate subjective bias. Michigan's objective parole law, enacted in 2018, requires adherence to clear, objective guidelines. And several other states are now using a clear and convincing evidence standard for denying parole, placing a higher bar on discretionary denials. Furthermore, New York and North Carolina now require the publishing of demographic data on parole outcomes, increasing transparency and accountability. These steps aim to reduce the very subjective elements, like assessing remorse, that have historically fueled disparities in who gets released and when.
Yeah, and what stands out here as a long-term, maybe more foundational solution is the push for greater diversity across all legal professions, improving K-12 civics education, creating robust mentorship programs specifically for attorneys of color, actively increasing outreach to diverse backgrounds for judicial careers. These are all crucial steps. If we connect this to the bigger picture, having a judiciary and an entire legal system that genuinely reflects the diversity of the population it serves, that's absolutely fundamental, not just for legitimacy and public trust, but for truly achieving equitable outcomes. It ensures a wider range of experiences and perspectives are brought to bear on these critical decisions.
Okay, moving on to some potentially bolder strategies like reallocating resources and critically decriminalizing poverty. Some prosecutors are truly leading the charge here. In places like Suffolk County, Massachusetts, and Baltimore, prosecutors have significantly reduced the criminal legal system's footprint. How? By refusing to prosecute many nonviolent misdemeanors and what they explicitly term crimes of poverty offenses, often driven by economic hardship, like minor theft or sleeping in public. This proactive approach has actually led to declining rearrest rates and, importantly, no observable increase in overall crime rates in those areas. It's a powerful argument for a different, more compassionate, and arguably more effective approach to public safety.
It really raises that important question about what truly constitutes public safety and where our resources are best allocated, doesn't it? Illinois, for instance, made history in 2023, became the first state to completely end cash bail, while also regulating the use of risk assessment tools and carefully limiting pretrial detention. New Jersey and Philadelphia also implemented significant reforms that dramatically reduced their pretrial jail populations and, crucially, did not lead to an increase in recidivism. These reforms aren't just about equity. They can save millions in criminal system costs annually, freeing up resources that could be reinvested into communities, into prevention. This is a direct and impactful attack on a key driver of inequity, preventing people from being jailed simply because they are poor.
And to ensure that everyone, regardless of their financial standing, has a fighting chance within the system. Bolstering indigent defense is absolutely critical. Public defenders. The federal public defense system actually offers a compelling model here. It demonstrates that adequately funded public defense leads to a lower likelihood of incarceration and shorter sentences for clients compared to underfunded systems. States like New York and Oregon are now actively increasing funding and rigorously enforcing standards of representation for public defenders. This truly is about ensuring equal access to justice regardless of an individual's income, which should be a fundamental tenet of a fair legal system.
Absolutely. And what's particularly fascinating here are the innovative, holistic defense models being implemented at various jurisdictions. Tribal defense offices, or TDOs, and nonprofits like Partners for Justice, they're pioneering approaches that go beyond just the legal representation in court. They partner with substance use specialists, housing authorities, community mentors to assist clients with a whole wide array of social and economic needs. These models provide tailored, culturally vetted resources. They focus on the root causes and broader social needs that often lead to legal entanglement in the first place, rather than just addressing the immediate legal issue. It's a much more comprehensive approach to justice.
And reforming community supervision parole, probation, is another key area with significant potential impact. California, for example, has implemented reforms that have demonstrably reduced recidivism and improved public safety by expanding access to parole for eligible individuals trusting the evidence. New York's Less is More Act, passed in 2021, strategically limits incarceration for technical parole violations. Those are minor infractions that aren't new crimes but often send people back to prison. And it redirects the significant savings from that reduced incarceration to provide vital services for people on parole: housing, treatment, job support. It's about shifting from a purely punitive model of supervision to one that genuinely supports successful reentry and reduces that revolving door of incarceration.
Finally, let's consider this emerging and I think highly actionable framework of behavioral analytic approaches to anti-racism. Drawing on thinkers like Ibram X. Kendi, this approach defines racism not as merely individual prejudice or bad feelings, but as a marriage of racist policies and racist ideas that produces and normalizes racial inequities. This perspective really emphasizes environmental and systemic factors over purely mentalistic explanations of individual attitudes or beliefs. And the term anti-racist itself encourages active engagement and intervention, rather than just a passive, not racist neutrality. It provides a clear behavioral framework for action, moving beyond just describing the problem to actively changing the conditions that produce it.
So, what do these behavioral analytic principles suggest are the actionable steps for anti-racism? What does that look like in practice?
Well, Kendi and behavior analytic principles suggest really concrete actions. Things like immediately adopting and consistently using anti-racist terminology. Actively punishing racist behavior now, punish in behavioral terms, can simply mean interrupting racist statements when you hear them, calling out bias, or maybe boycotting organizations that engage in or tolerate racist practices, reducing the reinforcement for that behavior. Conversely, it means reinforcing anti-racist behavior. That could be donating to anti-racist organizations, actively supporting businesses committed to equity. And crucially, it means actively voting for politicians with demonstrably anti-racist policy records, including those championing things like affordable housing, police accountability, equitable school funding. These are tangible, measurable actions that target the policies Kendi talks about.
And this approach also raises questions about training, right? Especially for law enforcement and corrections.
Yes, exactly. It raises an important question about how we fundamentally rethink training. Police training, for example, is often demonstrably insufficient in certain areas, with significantly more time historically spent on lethal weapons than on non-lethal de-escalation tactics, for example, and often a stark lack of objective performance measurement for critical skills like implicit bias mitigation. How do we know if the training is working? And look at the persistently high recidivism rates from simply jailing and imprisoning individuals. That shows us that this punitive approach, focused on punishment after the fact, is often not an effective intervention for truly reducing criminal behavior in the long term for many people. A behavioral analytic perspective would suggest refocusing efforts, moving away from ineffective punishment after a crime towards proactive antecedent interventions. That means addressing the root causes and triggers before the behavior occurs, investing significantly in community programs that target poverty, addiction, mental health, educational disparities directly, and ultimately maybe even redefining what constitutes criminal behavior in the first place, perhaps by definitively ending the remnants of the war on drugs, is also essential for achieving widespread anti-racist behavior change across the entire system. It's about changing the environment and the contingencies. #Outro.
Wow. Today, we've taken a really deep dive into the complex and, let's be honest, often troubling landscape of racial disparities in the U.S. criminal justice system. We've seen how these disparities persist across youth and adult populations, how they're influenced by evolving factors like class and education, and how they manifest at every single stage, from policing and initial contact right through to judicial sentencing and parole. We've also explored the profound and far-reaching societal consequences impacting everything from economic well-being and political trust to the fundamental health and stability of entire communities. And importantly, we've examined some of the proactive, innovative steps being taken and the proposed solutions aimed at addressing these deeply entrenched issues.
Yeah, and as consider the progress that has been made, but also the immense challenges that regrettably remain, especially with the very real risk of hard-won reforms stalling or even reversing in some places. A critical question emerges for all of us, I think, one that cuts right to the core of what justice in America truly means. If current incarceration trends were to genuinely become race-neutral, meaning Black and Hispanic individuals were incarcerated at the exact same rates as white individuals, our nation's prison and jail populations would decline by almost 40%. 40%.
So what would that profound shift actually mean? For our communities, for our economy, for the very fabric of American society, and perhaps more urgently, what is the true cost, the human cost, the social cost, the economic cost of not achieving that equitable future? It's a powerful and I think provocative question for you to reflect on as we conclude this deep dive.